Hi, I'm Leila Mizrahi. I'm a PhD student at the Swiss Seismological Service at ETH in Zurich. And today I will be talking about the project that I've been working on together with Shyam Nandan and Stefan Wieme about how we can embrace data incompleteness for better earthquake forecasting. Now, this session's called Beyond Poisson. So let me start by talking about how seismicity is not Poissonian. We all know that earthquakes can trigger aftershocks, which can then trigger own aftershocks and so on. And because of this behavior, earthquakes appear in clusters of space and time. Here on the left, we have a map of California with earthquakes since 1970. And in color, we have highlighted the 20 largest clusters as identified by the Gardner-Knopf declustering algorithm. Now, to avoid spatial biases and to be able to build upon this convenient assumption of Poissonianity, earthquake catalogs are usually declustered prior to being used for PSHA. That means that clusters are identified, and then from each cluster, the largest event, so the main shock, is kept in the catalog. Now, let's compare the frequency magnitude distribution of the full catalog compared to the decluster catalog here on the right. We see that the B value, so basically the slope of these fitted lines here, substantially differs between the full catalog and the declustered catalog. And in our recently published paper, we systematically assessed the effect of declustering on the size distribution of main shocks. And we found that declustering does actually introduce a bias to the B value of the Gutenberg-Richter law. And one of our conclusions is that we should try to avoid doing PSHA based on declustered catalogs and rather move towards other approaches. One such other approach is, for instance, provided by the epidemic type aftershock sequence, or ETAS model. In ETAS, we distinguish background events and triggered events, and all events can trigger aftershocks, and they can trigger their own aftershocks, and so on. And the aftershock triggering is based on these 4 empirical principles that we have here on the right. The productivity law describes the expected number of aftershocks an earthquake will have given its magnitude. Then we have spatial distribution and temporal distribution of aftershocks around their triggering event. And then, of course, the Gutenberg-Richter law describing the magnitude distribution. Now, if we want to issue a forecast using ETAS, we need to first calibrate the parameters describing these laws based on the data that we have observed so far. And then once this is done, we simulate thousands of possible scenarios of how the current situation could continue. And as a side note, with this approach, we can do both short-term and long-term forecasting. If we are interested in a 50-year forecast, for instance, we just simulate the next 50 years 100,000 times. So to calibrate such an ETAS model, we need a catalog that is complete above a certain threshold magnitude, the magnitude of completeness. And usually this is assumed to be constant in time. But okay, here on the left, we have then a map of California since 1932. And on the bottom, we have the same set of events on a time versus magnitude plot. And we can see that during the earlier years, the magnitude of completeness was much higher. And then as the seismic network improves and becomes more efficient at also detecting smaller magnitude events, MC decreases. MC can, of course, also vary for other reasons, such as short-term aftershock incompleteness. MC can vary with space due to the configuration of the network. But overall, assuming a constant magnitude of completeness means that, first of all, we're unable to use the data from earlier years because the catalog was just not as complete back then. It means that during some times we would be underestimating MC, so we would assume to be complete even though we're not. It means that during other times we would overestimate MC, so that means we would throw away large amounts of small magnitude data. And overall, for this particular example, that means that we would be able to use less than 22,000 out of the available 56,000 events. So we developed a method with which we can actually account for a time-varying magnitude of completeness in the calibration of the ETAS model. That means that we can use all of the smaller magnitude data as well, which allows us to more clearly delineate faults. It means that we're able to include also historical data, and just overall being able to use this large fraction of data means that in some regions we might be able to calibrate an ETAS model where previously we were unable to do so due to missing data. Now this model requires MC of t as an input, and especially if we want to look at short-term aftershock incompleteness, it is not so straightforward to estimate that. So for this particular case, we developed a second model, which is kind of complementary to this first one, in which we consider a probabilistic rate-dependent aftershock incompleteness. In essence, this means we look at a detection probability function for an earthquake to be detected. And so the probability to be detected is smaller when the magnitude of the earthquake is smaller, and it is also dependent on the current rate of events. So when the current rate of events is smaller, detection probability would increase. And okay, so we developed a method with which we can then jointly estimate the ETAS parameters and this detection probability function. And we do so by first estimating the ETAS parameters in the usual way, so assuming a constant magnitude of completeness. And then knowing the ETAS parameters, we can calculate the current rate of events at each point in time, because that's basically what ETAS is all about, right? We can calculate the rates of aftershocks of all previous events plus the background rates. And then having this current event rate at each point in time allows us to calibrate our detection probability function. And then this gives us an idea of how complete or how incomplete the catalog is at different points in time. Now, this information then lets us re-estimate the ETAS parameters, accounting for this incompleteness. So now we can use data not only above the magnitude of completeness, but also data below MC. And just having an idea of how incomplete we are, we can correct for this incompleteness in the calibration, allowing us to use also data that is below MC. And okay, then having a new set of ETAS parameters gives us then, of course, a new set of event rates, and this gives us a new detection probability function, and so on. And this goes on until everything converges. Now we wanted to test whether or how this method can be useful for earthquake forecasting. And for this, we performed a forecasting experiment for California with 4 competing models. The base model being a basic ETAS model with a constant magnitude of completeness of 3.1. And here we are modeling magnitude 3.1 and above earthquakes. So they are allowed to trigger and be triggered. The alternative model is then the one that I just described that has these 2 new ingredients. One ingredient being the newly estimated set of ETAS parameters, and the other ingredient being the estimation of the incompleteness of the catalog at each point in time, which allows us to include smaller magnitude events in our simulations. So in our case, this means we would be modeling magnitude 2.5 and above events. They are allowed to trigger and be triggered. And during those times when we know that we're not complete at that magnitude, we at least have an idea of how incomplete we are, and we can correct for this incompleteness in the simulations. Now, to then distinguish the effects of these 2 ingredients, we have 2 intermediate models. One is the parameter only model that only uses the newly estimated ETAS parameters, but not the incompleteness information. So here we model 3.1 and above events. And then the other one is the complementary one, the triggering only model, where we only use the incompleteness information, allowing us to include small magnitude data, but we use the parameters that we had estimated for the base model, the ETAS parameters. And then to compare all of those 4 models, we do a pseudo-prospective forecasting experiment. That means that we calibrate all of the models using data up until some point in time, pretending to not know what's going to happen afterwards. And then with each of the models, we issue a forecast for the next 30 days. And we can then compare what actually happened to the 4 different forecasts. And this is then done for several consecutive of such testing periods. In our case, we have 243 30-day testing periods. And to compare 2 forecasts in one particular testing period, we use the information gain as defined in Nandan et al. 2019 to have an idea of which model outperforms which other model for one testing period. And we look at this for several different target magnitude thresholds. For instance, for a target magnitude threshold of 3.1, this means that we are interested to correctly forecast the number of magnitude 3.1 or above events. And here on the left, we see the cumulative information gain, so accumulated over the consecutive testing periods of the 3 alternative models in color compared to the null model in black here. And we see that both the full model with both ingredients and the triggering only model clearly outperform the null model, while the parameter only model does not outperform the null model. And this suggests that the main driver of this improvement is actually the inclusion of small magnitude events in the simulations. Now, if we then increase the target magnitude threshold, and we now want to correctly forecast the number of magnitude 3.5 or above, or 4 or 4.5 or 5 earthquakes, we see that none of the models outperform each other anymore. And in another paper of Nandan et al., they found that the size distribution of aftershocks is actually dependent on the magnitude of their triggering event. So they found that earthquakes tend to trigger similarly sized aftershocks. And we think that this could be a possible explanation of what we observe here. So including small magnitude events in the simulations lets us better forecast similarly sized events. But when the difference between the magnitude of the newly included events and the target events becomes large, we don't see this effect anymore. So besides being able to more accurately forecast relatively small sized earthquakes, we also have this useful insight, which can then guide us in the development of the next, even better forecasting models. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please reach out now or any other time. Thank you.